When the sliding doors of Casablanca Airport shut behind me, it wasn't just the noise of the world outside that faded, it was everything I had ever known. I stood there for a moment, my passport clenched in one hand and my boarding pass in the other, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I wasn't just boarding a flight, I was leaving my entire world behind. I was 27 years old, born and raised in Tangier, Morocco. Life hadn't been terrible, but it hadn't felt like mine either. Every morning, I woke up with the feeling that my life was happening somewhere else, in another place, maybe even in another language. That place for me had always been the United States, New York, a city I had never seen except in movies, but that somehow felt more familiar than my own hometown. The days leading up to my departure had been a blur. My mother had packed my bags 3 times, convinced I was forgetting something. My father had barely spoken, his silence a mix of pride and sadness. He had never left Morocco in his life, and now his only son was crossing an ocean. My friends threw me a small party, mostly filled with laughter and cheap jokes about me becoming American. But the truth was, they all admired me. I was doing what we all dreamed of but never dared to chase. But I had dared. I'd spent months preparing, saving money for my job at a call center, watching YouTube videos to improve my English, applying for a student visa, and finally being accepted to a language school in Manhattan. It wasn't Harvard, but it was my ticket, my one-way ticket to another life. As the plane took off, I stared out the window. Morocco shrank beneath me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. I felt scared, yes, but also free. The first shock came during my layover in Frankfurt. A woman at a cafe asked me something in German, and I replied nervously in English, but my words stumbled over each other. I realized then how far I still had to go. If I wanted to build a life in New York, I had to do more than speak English. I had to think in English, live in English. When I finally landed in JFK, it was already dark. The lights of the city stretched for miles, like veins glowing beneath the skin of a sleeping giant. I couldn't stop staring. This was it. New York, the city that never sleeps, the city that would either make me or break me. I had rented a small room in Queens with another international student from Colombia named Mateo. We had only exchanged a few messages online, but he greeted me like a brother at the airport. He helped me carry my suitcase down into the subway, and for the next hour we rumbled beneath the city, surrounded by strangers, neon ads, in a language I could barely understand in real time. The apartment was tiny, barely enough space for 2 beds and a small table, but it was ours. Mateo handed me a bowl of rice and beans and said, "Welcome home, Mohamed." I almost cried. The next morning, the jet lag hit me like a wall. But I couldn't waste time. My language classes started at 9 a.m., and I was determined to arrive early. I put on the only nice shirt I had brought and took the subway into Manhattan. The language school was on the 8th floor of an old office building, and the elevator smelled like bleach and nervousness. I stepped into the classroom, and for the first time, I wasn't the only foreigner. There were students from Brazil, China, Turkey, and even Russia. We were all chasing the same dream, to belong. Our teacher, Emily, was young and energetic. She greeted each of us with a warm smile and asked us to introduce ourselves. "My name is Mohamed," I said when it was my turn. "I am from Morocco. I want to learn English because I want to change my life." Emily nodded, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was understanding, maybe it was hope, but it gave me courage. Every day after that was a battle. I wrote down every new word I heard, repeated sentences to myself on the subway, watched American shows with subtitles, and forced myself to speak, even when I was afraid of sounding ridiculous. And I did sound ridiculous sometimes, but I kept going. Mateo and I quickly became friends. In the evenings, we'd cook together, exchange words in Spanish and Arabic, and share our dreams. He wanted to open a cafe one day. I wanted to become an entrepreneur. I didn't know in what yet, but I knew I wanted to build something of my own. One night, as we sat on the fire escape of our building, looking out at the city lights, Mateo said, "Do you ever feel like we're in a movie?" "All the time," I replied. We laughed, but deep inside I felt it. I wasn't just living a story, I was writing a new one. By the time the airplane touched down at JFK Airport, Mohammed's heart was pounding. Not just from the flight, he had never flown this long before, but from the feeling that his life was about to change forever. As he stepped into the bustling terminal, the cold air of New York pierced through his jacket. He had underestimated the American winter. Again. He pulled his worn-out scarf tighter around his neck, clutching the handles of his modest suitcase. Everything he owned was inside it, not just clothes, but his hopes, his dreams, and a printed sheet of paper that had become his lifeline, his student visa and the address of the English language school where he was about to begin. Mohamed had studied English before, of course, in high school through YouTube with podcasts, but learning from Morocco and actually living in an English-speaking country, that was a different story. The taxi ride into Manhattan was surreal. The skyline unfolded before him like a dream. He had seen it in movies, on posters, on Instagram, but nothing compared to the real thing. The bright lights, the towering buildings, the energy that seemed to pulse through the streets. His school was in Queens, a neighborhood full of life, color, and accents from around the world. It wasn't glamorous, but it was alive. And Mohamed liked that. His room was tiny, but it had a bed, a desk, and a window. It was enough. He was not here to be comfortable. He was here to grow. Classes started the next morning. Nervous, he arrived early, wearing the cleanest shirt he had. The first thing he noticed was that the school was full of people like him. Young men and women from Brazil, China, Senegal, Ukraine, Colombia. They had different stories, but the same goal, to learn English and to build a new life. The first few weeks were difficult. The teachers were kind, but they spoke fast, too fast. Sometimes Mohamed would smile and nod even when he didn't understand. He hated doing that. He wanted to understand. He wanted to speak. So he doubled down. Every day after class, he went to the library. He borrowed children's books to read out loud. He watched cartoons in English with subtitles. He recorded himself speaking and listened to his pronunciation. He even forced himself to start small conversations at the grocery store, at the laundromat with neighbors. Most people were patient. Some weren't. He kept going anyway. He also started working part-time at a small Moroccan restaurant not far from his school. The owner, Samir, had moved to the US 20 years earlier and spoke perfect English. With a thick Brooklyn accent, Samir became both a boss and a mentor. He let Mohamed practice English with customers, correct his mistakes, and even try his hand at cooking sometimes. "You need to live in English," Samir told him one night while closing the restaurant. "Don't just study it. Eat in English, think in English, dream in English." That advice changed everything. Little by little, Mohamed began to feel the shift. He could understand full conversations. He could make jokes. He started thinking in English without realizing it. One day, a classmate asked where he was from, and Mohamed answered in English, without translating from French or Arabic in his head. He smiled all the way home. But New York wasn't just about English. It was also about life. He was far from his family. He missed his mother's cooking, his sister's laughter, the sound of the call to prayer from the mosque near his home in Casablanca. Some nights, the loneliness felt heavier than his winter coat, but he reminded himself why he came. Every day, he wrote in his notebook, "I am building my new life." In that notebook, he also wrote ideas, business ideas, stories, quotes that inspired him. He didn't know exactly what his future would be, but he knew he wanted to create something that mattered. One day, during a school workshop about entrepreneurship, a guest speaker talked about how she built an online tutoring business from her kitchen table. Mohamed listened with wide eyes. She didn't have money, she didn't have connections, but she had a skill and a Wi-Fi connection. That was enough. That night, Mohamed couldn't sleep. He kept thinking, what can I teach? What do I know that others want to learn? And then it hit him. He could teach Arabic, or French, or even share Moroccan culture. There were people all over the world interested in learning. He just needed to start. So he did. With Samir's help, he created a basic website. He filmed short videos on his phone, sharing common Arabic phrases, Moroccan expressions, and even recipes. He spoke slowly, clearly, always smiling. He was shy at first, his accent was strong, but his passion came through. And little by little, people began to notice. He got his first student, then 5, then 10. He reinvested everything he earned into better equipment, a microphone, a ring light, a new laptop. He improved his website, took online marketing courses, and asked for feedback constantly. He was obsessed with learning, not just English anymore, but business, psychology, video editing, branding. Within a year, he was teaching full-time. From his tiny room in Queens, Mohamed was helping students from around the world, in Japan, Canada, Brazil, learn Arabic and discover Moroccan culture. But more importantly, he was building something for himself, a future, a voice, a life. As Mohamed's online teaching business continued to grow, so did his confidence. He no longer walked the streets of New York as a newcomer, unsure of his place. He walked with purpose. Every cafe he entered, every conversation he had, every small success reminded him of how far he'd come and how far he still wanted to go. His schedule was now full of lessons. Mornings were for private classes with students in Europe and the Middle East. Afternoons were for editing content, updating his website, and researching better ways to reach his audience. Evenings were reserved for students in the Americas. Sometimes he barely had time to eat, but for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive. Still, deep down, Mohamed knew he couldn't stay in that small room forever. It had been a good starting point, a safe cocoon for his transformation, but it wasn't meant to be permanent. So, one Sunday afternoon, he took a long walk through Brooklyn with a coffee in hand and made a decision. It was time to move forward. He opened a savings account and began setting aside money each week. Slowly but surely, the dream of renting his own apartment, maybe even with a small office corner, began to take shape. Around that same time, something unexpected happened. While scrolling through Instagram one night, he came across a video from a young entrepreneur named Sarah. She was originally from Nigeria, and she shared her story about moving to the US, struggling with the language, and eventually starting a clothing business that celebrated African culture. The way she spoke, the way she smiled. There was something magnetic about her. He left a comment thanking her for her story. To his surprise, she replied. They started messaging, first casually, then more frequently. They talked about their journeys, their cultures, their challenges and dreams. Sarah lived in Harlem, and after 2 weeks of chatting, they decided to meet for coffee. That first meeting turned into 3 hours of non-stop talking. They laughed, they listened, and they understood each other in a way that felt natural, easy. There was no pressure, just connection. Sarah had built her brand from scratch too. They exchanged ideas, encouraged each other, even filmed a video together where Mohamed taught her a few Moroccan expressions, and she taught him how to pronounce Nigerian food names. The video went semi-viral on TikTok, bringing in thousands of new followers to both of them. Together, they brainstormed. What if we created something that mixed cultures? Sarah asked one day. A space where people could learn not just languages, but also the stories, the food, the traditions behind those languages. The idea sparked something deep inside Mohamed. That was it. That was the next step. They called it Roots in Words, an online platform where users could learn languages and discover cultures through storytelling, recipes, interviews, and music. Sarah brought her design and branding skills. Mohamed created the educational content and stories. They spent months building it in the evenings and on weekends. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, technical issues, and disagreements, but they always found their way back to the vision. To fund the platform, they launched a small crowdfunding campaign. Mohamed was nervous. What if no one supports us? He asked. Sarah smiled and said, let's believe that they will. They recorded a simple video, sharing their story, their mission, and the dream behind Roots in Words. They posted it everywhere. YouTube, Instagram, their mailing lists, and to their amazement, the support poured in. Former students of Mohamed, followers of Sarah, and complete strangers backed the project. They didn't raise millions, but they raised enough to launch. When the site finally went live, it was more beautiful than Mohamed had imagined. The homepage welcomed visitors with a video of Mohamed and Sarah, introducing themselves in their native languages. The platform offered short language lessons, cultural deep dives, guest interviews, and live Kwanda sessions. One of the most popular sections was My Journey, where Mohamed narrated his full story, from Casablanca to Queens, from English student to entrepreneur. The feedback was overwhelming. People wrote from Argentina, Egypt, Canada, South Korea, I cried listening to your story. I want to do what you did. Thank you for inspiring me." For Mohammed, those messages meant more than money. They were proof that his struggle had not been in vain, that his story, a story of courage, persistence, and reinvention, had the power to light the way for others. Meanwhile, his personal life blossomed. He and Sarah grew closer, not just as business partners, but as friends, and eventually more. They celebrated their first anniversary with a picnic in Central Park, reflecting on the whirlwind year behind them. But Mohammed wasn't done dreaming. "I want to go back to Morocco one day," he told Sarah one evening as they walked along the East River, "not to stay, but to give something back." She nodded. "Let's build something that reaches people there too." So they did. They added French and Arabic tracks to Roots and Words, allowing users in North Africa and the Middle East to access their content in multiple languages. They began offering scholarships to students who couldn't afford classes. Mohammed returned to his old high school in Casablanca, virtually, to give a guest talk. His old English teacher cried during the call. The circle was complete. From that moment on, Mohammed felt at peace. Not because life was perfect, it wasn't, but because he was living fully, truthfully, and with purpose. He had crossed oceans, built bridges, and found love not just in another person, but in himself. One cold December morning, exactly 4 years after Mohammed had landed at JFK Airport, with nervous hands and a heart full of dreams, he stood on stage at a language learning conference in Chicago. The auditorium was filled with teachers, creators, and language lovers from all over the world. His keynote was titled, "From Casablanca to New York, How Language Saved My Life." As he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience, he took a deep breath. Then he began. "When I arrived in the United States, I barely spoke English. I had no friends, no money, and no idea what I was doing. But I had a story, and that story became my bridge to people, to opportunity, and eventually to freedom." His voice was steady, his message was clear. Learning English hadn't just opened doors, it had rewritten the entire course of his life. After his talk, dozens of people came to meet him. Some hugged him, some cried, some asked to collaborate. Among them were school administrators who wanted to bring Roots and Words into their classrooms, journalists who wanted to interview him, a documentary filmmaker who had followed his journey online and now wanted to tell his story to the world. Mohammed felt overwhelmed, not by pressure, but by gratitude. That night, back in his hotel room, he sat with his laptop and opened the very first email he had sent to a teacher when he was learning English. "Hello, my name is Mohamed. I'm from Morocco. I want to speak English. Please help me." He smiled. He had no idea then that one email, written with broken grammar and hope, would start a chain reaction that would change his entire life. Back in New York, Roots and Words was thriving. They had hired 2 part-time editors, 3 language tutors, and were preparing to open their first physical studio in Brooklyn, a space for recording, live events, and community workshops. Sarah was now his business partner, his creative soulmate, and his fiancée. He had proposed to her during a sunset walk on the High Line, with a simple ring and a heartfelt message. "You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me before I believed in myself." She had cried, then laughed, then said yes. Together they were planning a trip to Morocco the following summer. It would be Mohammed's first time back home since leaving. He wanted to see his family, walk the streets of Casablanca again, and bring Sarah to meet the people who had raised him. But most of all, he wanted to give talks in schools, not just about language, but about self-belief, resilience, and chasing your purpose. One day, he received an email from a 16-year-old boy in Fez. "My name is Rashid. I saw your video. I'm scared because I don't think I can learn English, but your story gave me courage. I'm going to try." Mohammed wrote back immediately. "Dear Rashid, I was scared too, but fear is not the end of the road. It's the beginning. You can learn, you can grow, and one day someone will write to you saying, 'Thank you for inspiring me.' Keep going. I'm with you." He knew exactly how that boy felt, because he had been him. And now his job was not just to build a company, it was to build bridges between cultures, between hearts, between dreams and reality. As he looked around his new apartment, now bright, warm, and filled with books, candles, and laughter, he thought about the person he used to be. The quiet boy afraid to speak, the young man who had cried alone his first week in New York, the beginner who had stumbled through verbs and vocabulary, who had doubted himself with every step. He no longer saw failure when he looked at his past. He saw fuel. Every rejection, every lonely night, every mistake had pushed him forward. Every broken word had built a stronger voice. And now that voice was helping others find their own. That's what language had given him. Not just communication, but connection. Not just success, but meaning. Roots in Words had become more than a platform. It was a movement. People from over 50 countries had joined. They shared recipes, recorded poems, wrote essays about their migration journeys. Teachers were using Mohamed's story to inspire their students. Nonprofits were adapting his materials for refugee programs. His story had traveled farther than he had ever imagined. And yet, despite all the external success, Mohamed remained grounded. He still began each day with gratitude. A journal, a coffee, a quiet moment to remind himself, I am here, I am enough, I am building something that matters. In the spring, when Roots in Words hosted their first live event in Brooklyn, over 200 people came. They filled the room with laughter, music, food from different countries, and shared stories of transformation. One woman, originally from Turkey, stood up during the Konda and said, I used to think I was too old to learn, but then I saw your video, and now I'm not only learning, I'm teaching others too. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Mohamed nodded, his eyes misty. He realized that night that his real success wasn't just in income or followers, it was in impact, in the quiet ripples his story had made in the lives of others, in the invisible hands he had helped lift. That evening, walking home with Sarah under the stars, he whispered, This is what I dreamed of, not fame, not money, just this, a life where I can be myself and help others become more of who they are too. And in that quiet, magical moment, with the hum of New York all around them and the warmth of purpose in their hearts, Mohamed knew something with absolute certainty. He had not just moved to a new country, he had moved into a new version of himself, and this version was finally home.